Hello, everyone. Hi. This is Gamer Stories episode 7, which is this thing that I just decided to start doing over the summer, where I invite a gamer that I know or even don't know so well to come and just be on the show and just talk about their gaming history and what they've done and what gaming means to them, mainly because there's so many different gamers and everyone has a different story and a different life path. And I just thought it would be great to highlight the diversity of different gaming experiences and all the ways in which there are a lot of different gamers. And I am so excited to have AljernonBolden as my guest today, who is a gamer that I have admired from afar, watched on shows and thought, oh, what a great gamer. How amazing.
Aww.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm just going to make you sound really good because you're amazing. And who I have wanted to play with for a long time, and you know, it's probably going to happen. Secrets. So why don't you introduce yourself to everybody in chat?
Hi everyone, my name is AljernonBolden. I am the lead engineer on Battletech. I've been working for Hairbrained Schemes for the last 8 or so years. So I've made games such as Shadowrun, Dragonfall in Hong Kong, Strike Fleet Omega, and I've been on channels such as Hyper RPG and Geekspace TV. So I've been doing a lot of the live play things. So though I'm currently on hiatus, so I'm kind of like a general area nerd.
And also, you're designing an RPG as well, like a tabletop RPG.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a concept called Brown and Down Gods. My aim is for it to be done by Big Bad Con, but the entire game is being a deity through the lens of marginalizations. If you are an all-powerful being, but you're still secondary to someone else, doesn't really matter how powerful you are. And it's playing through those kind of motions of that. So hopefully it'll be out soon, and you'll hear more on my Twitter.
And maybe you're going to be doing some... Now, I was lucky enough to do some testing already, so like that's exciting. But also, I think you'll be doing some at Big Bad Con, maybe?
That is the hope. Right now, I have one playtest before then. If it's close to ready, I'll try to do it. Otherwise, I'm gonna bail out and be a chicken.
Don't be a chicken. I enjoyed the playtest very much. It was an honor to be in it. Sal is like, wait, are you gonna play that game that takes place during the Harlem Renaissance? Yes. Well, actually, this is actually wartime. I've got to figure out the exact year. I think it's probably like 1940, 41. It's during the war. The war is still going on, but Langston Wright I think he was injured and is out of the war. But it's, you know, it's a great time to be African American in Washington, D.C. in the United States in the 1940s.
So great.
So great. So great. Just like today.
Yeah, I was gonna make a joke, but then I was like, no, probably shouldn't do that. Something with red hats. That's all I'm gonna say.
Something with red hats. So I'm gonna ask him a couple questions, but then all of y'all in chat can also ask him questions. But I want to start with, tell me, where are you from?
That's an interesting question. So I was actually born in College Park, Georgia, and if anyone knows anything about hip hop, it's one of the seminal places of Southern rap. Lived there all of 2 years, though. I was a baby when I moved out. So I actually claim Boston as my hometown.
Really?
Yeah, I actually lived a lot of my early life there in middle school and early high school there. So that's where I got a little bit of my accent from.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my early education came from there before I moved on to Florida. But really, I've been everywhere. I've been South Florida, Miami area. I've been in Orlando. I've been in Tallahassee. I've been in Iowa City. I've been in Boston, and now I live in Seattle. So I've been the kind of migrant. Both of my parents are professors in university.
Of what?
So my father is a dentist, and so he taught public dentistry. And then my mom is a sociologist and an occupational therapist. So depending on which college she went on, she taught one or the other.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and it's also one of the reasons why I didn't enter academia like full time.
Because you're like, oh, I know what this is like.
Oh yeah,
this is rough.
It is very satisfying on a cerebral level, and then on a monetary level and job security, unless you can hustle for tenure.
Yeah,
it can be rough.
Yeah, and you're never going to get paid the big bucks. I mean,
no, I don't know if you can get on like the lecture circuit. I think.
Sure, but I think if you're in sciences, you'll make money.
That's true.
You know, I mean, because if you're in the sciences, you're like, I'm in the sciences, pay me lots of money. I'm in the humanities, they're like, would you like $50? And like, I was like, do I get free lunch?
So the interesting thing, just like a little bit off tangent, is that
One
my
moment.
dad,
My house, I'm gonna give you candy. Come on to my house, I'm gonna give you everything. Grinny, thank you so much for the host. That was a Grinny giving us the host. Thank you, Grinny.
Hi, Grinny.
You were saying.
Oh, I was saying, so interesting enough, in the side tangent to gaming, one thing I found out, because my dad does public dentistry, is you get a lot of attempted kickbacks from the people like Crest and Colgate, because there's a constant arms race in the dentistry world for, toothpaste, toothbrushes, oral supplies. And so they want to get any means necessary. And since most places that teach dentistry have a hospital attached, they send all sorts of supplies because they just want you to get a partial stock of it. So just like they spend thousands upon that just so you buy a season's worth.
Wow. That is not even what happens with me. With me, I'll get a copy of like some history of rock and roll textbook and they're like, do you want to use it? And then I will say like either yes or no, usually no, because they're often not good. And then if I do use it, I'll say, hey, can I get like 2 free copies for my TAs? And they're like, no. And I was like, come on. Like that's my life.
Yeah, I think the money is like not the academia, but it's like anything associated with it. So if you have like a touring band or something like that, they can put their name attached, that's when they throw the money at you.
Yeah. Nobody cares for us. But it's so funny because I was thinking about how like most of the time, like if I'm lucky, they'll pay for my airfare. That is my life. But there's like I was thinking about the huge difference, the disparity in pay between arts and humanities and STEM folks is just.
It's insane.
It's insane.
And we can really go on to a long rant about how that's kind of affected society as a whole, because they're steering people more and more into STEM and turn humanities into electives and not even required for your undergrad years. And I feel like that's making like sorry, I'm about to go into a society rant again, which is that we now have people that are very technically in depth but don't have understanding of communications and of this
ethics,
sociology. And this is like, and so when we have events that happen recently and they're like, oh, this is brand new, and you can say, no, it's not. This has happened before. How do you handle it? This is how historical trends has happened. This is how one set of humans interacts with the other. And it might not be the same, but you can make great learnings off of it. But we don't really teach young people that anymore.
This reminds me actually of a moment that was like really made me all teary-eyed and happy in a video game. And it was Mass Effect 2, I think, where, Morden Solus, right, is doing all the science. And they're like, wait, like Gilbert and Sullivan? Like, why you're a scientist? Why would you care about those things? And he was talking about how he made this really marvelous case for the arts and humanities in this video game, right? About the importance of the arts and humanities and also the ways in which he was able to figure out that the collectors were sort of basically an artificial species because they had no ergonomics. And so that they had all their technology had no ergonomics, which meant it was actually fairly unhealthy for the collectors to use their tech, which in his mind is like, oh, that means that it was probably all created by some sort of larger species that does not care about them, right? And like the ways in which and it made me happy, of course, but it made me happy because here are video games, right? Video games are a mixture of art and science together. You can't have video games without both.
Oh, very much so. And that is like one of the great joys and one of the great pain points of making games is how collaborative it is and how much you depend on everyone's expertise. And it's a perfect marriage of the two, because I've seen games that have splendid technology behind them and have some brilliant minds, but don't necessarily put the effort into making a compelling story and making good puzzle mechanics, of thinking what the experience is of the user, which is kind of a realm that's outside of typical game design. And that can really stymie a game. But if you have them in harmony and they work together, it can be a force multiplier.
Yeah. Sal says, and they don't have any perceivable art or culture, and no advanced society can exist without, a society, right? And enjoy your date night, Grinny.
Bye, Granny.
And Sorenstrom, I studied electrical engineering. I love music, but I need to live up to my parents' expectations. And isn't that always the tricky thing, that parents want their children to pick the careers they think are best for them, but may not be best for them?
I've been thinking a lot about that. And I say that because I'm in the game industry, and it's a volatile industry. So I often get asked, how do I get in? Should I go into games? And it's a very interesting ask, because like the logical side of you wants to say no. And the reason why I say no is because it is no guarantee to get a job. When you do, the stability is actually relatively poor. You work long hours. Your pay for the equivalent position outside of gaming is lower in general. However, none of that matters at the end of the day. If you love creating art, if you love working with people and love collaborating, I can't imagine myself doing anything else. But it's a struggle. And so it's like, I can understand the theory, especially when you're talking about your children. It's like you want what's best for them, and you want what's easier. And sometimes the passion road is not an easy road. It's a rough one. But it can be ultimately more fulfilling. It's really on an individual basis.
Tell me how you got into gaming. How did it start?
So this is not going to paint me in a good light.
I'm excited.
So here's what happened. So my sister is a writer, a journalist. So she went to NYU and then eventually got a master's and PhD there. Or no, just a master's, sorry. My mom has a PhD and my dad has a master. Both of them from Harvard. That's for the master's. So we come from an academic background. I took it as a matter of course that I would get into college, that I would get into an Ivy League school. So when I was a senior in high school, I applied to 2 schools. I applied to Brown, because, why not? It's going to be easy for me to get to Brown University. And then my backup school was Boston University.
Okay.
Boston University was because I had, what's it called when you have a lot of family go there?
Like a legacy.
Yeah, I have a legacy there. So my mom went there, my aunt went there, my father did courses there, taught there as well. So I've had like at least 4 or 5 members that have history there. So I thought it was a shoo-in. And then a couple things happened. One, I was relatively lazy in high school, as one is. I kind of glided on my tests. This was during the time of No Child Left Behind. And I lived in Florida at the time, which is especially hit by No Child Left Behind. And they taught the tests. They did not teach the courses, and you could glide if you had high test scores, and I did. So because of that, I helped them get good funding. And so they didn't really care what I did as long as I tested well. So that's the first thing happened. The second thing that happened is that we had a scandal with our guidance counselor. It turned out that he got fired for fraud, among other things. And he didn't even properly submit academic records for many of the students. I wasn't aware of that at the time. But the ultimate result is I didn't get to Brown, I didn't get to BU, and I was like kind of faced with 3 options. Either take a year off, go to community college, or do some sort of service work. At the time, I was still having tensions with my mother because I was a senior in high school. You want to get out of the house. You kind of want to fly free. And so a friend of mine was like, there's this school called Full Sail down in Orlando. It does games. So I just drove down there one night and took the tour and decided on the day that that's what I want to do.
Wow.
So I kind of fell into it.
Were you playing video games before then?
Yes, at that point, I was a pretty hardcore gamer. I would say that I was a casual gamer my entire life. Throughout the 90s, I had every single Nintendo system. This was about, what we're talking about, 2003-ish. What turned me into a full-time gamer was StarCraft, and StarCraft Brood Wars in particular. Not just for the competitive aspect, but that's the first game where, like, when I bought it, it gave me a tomb like this big of lore and background that you might not see in a game. And I was like, wow, this is an amazing piece of media, and I wanted, and like, it consumed my life. Also at that time, I was starting to get into the mushing scene pretty heavily. For people who don't know, mush is multi-user shared hallucinations. They're a text-based game you play online with other people. So people usually know about MUDs, which is like Zork is not MUD, but it's kind of like that, except now you play multiplayer. Things like Gemstone on AOL are another example of MUDs. Mushes take away all the automation, though. There is no mechanics. You just play with other humans. That's actually where I met Liz.
Really?
Yeah. we met online on Mushes. We hit it off. Well, no, first I ruined her relationship that she was having with another person in character.
What was
And
the
then
mush?
the first Mush I ever played, well, the one that I met her on was called Ultimate Marvel Mush. I'm a superhero player all the way. That's my specialty. And so on the game, I particularly remember I was playing an OC and she was playing Jubilee. And in this world, Jubilee was part of Weapon X, and my character had just escaped. And he sees her on a date with her boyfriend, and he thought that she was trying to recruit him into Weapon X. He's like, "No, she's dangerous. Run away!" And he, yeah,
Yeah, I was playing mushes. It was New Orleans by night. I was doing vampire mushes.
vampires.
I was doing vampire mushes.
They're their own series of fun.
And
we could probably do an entire series just on mushes.
Oh yeah, and then of course, what's funny about it, I was just thinking about, right, to do the mushes, like you're forever, you're learning coding, right? Like you're learning the tiny mush language, so you can make your own apartments and whatever you got going on.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, even though there is no direct like combat code or anything like that, you create these gigantic cities. And everyone has their rooms. You don't really need them because you can use theater of the mind if you want, but you felt like you have a piece of ownership if you have your little corner room that you can have like a little bobble. Like you can have a piece of dice there. You code the dice yourself. Yeah. You don't need the dice, but it feels good.
And Lizzie, I was on Crescent City. That is correct. That is correct.
We need to talk later because you might know people that we know.
Maybe this was when I was in the army. So I was in Germany and I was like, I found mushes. This was late 90s, right? And, well, like 96, 95, 96, 97. And I was in Crescent City, doing my little mushes and being like coding my apartment and making all the descriptions for all the places. And it's funny. Oh, you too, Lizzie. Like, and what's crazy about it is that, look at the world we live in right now. Like we have massive MMOs and MOBAs, and like when you think about the world we live in right now, when you go back to, it wasn't even that long ago, we were all just like using the little tiny mush language to give descriptions for our apartments and like making a second room.
I mean, like I never actually made the full transition over into MMOs for roleplay, partially because the theater of the mind is so encapsulating. It's like I like the MMO, like I'm locked to these avatars. I see what they are and I'm kind of stuck on that. But when it's just a black and white screen with words, it adds a new layer. And since I didn't have role-playing groups to play with, that was kind of my escape for that. I miss mushing too sometimes. I talk to Lizzie about this a lot, but I think it's nostalgia playing because here's a kind of the opposite side of mushing is that you can spend hours and hours playing these elaborate scenes, but the majority of the time you're sitting in a lobby talking for hours on end, or even if you're in these epic scenes, it takes 3 or 4 hours to get through a single round because at least in the circles we were in, people didn't write 1 or 2 lines. We wrote paragraphs.
Yes.
Like this is short stories. And so you're waiting, it takes me 20 or 30 minutes to do mine. Then I have to wait for the 3 other people to do 20, 30 minutes to make their epic poses.
Oh, Krellin was in Elendor the Tolkien mush.
Really?
Yeah. He said, now I'm like, I just feel like, is Jared into the room, his eyes scanning each world. Like for me, when I think about World of Darkness mushes, it was a lot of going into that main cafe nightclub and like describing yourself walking in just like Jared did and sitting down in the corner looking mysteriously and seeing if people would talk to you. There was just a lot of like walking in dramatically and sitting down at corner tables. That was
like I've tried my best not to deviate because we could do an entire show of the culture of mushes because it was amazing. And there's a parasocial relationship before that was even like a really, well, I shouldn't say that because I don't know parasocial has been around for decades, but before the general audience, the general world kind of knew what that relationship was. Yeah. But you attach to these people online, you would have bleed. Yeah. You would have all these things going on. And it took a while to warm up to like groups. You'd think that you would jump in immediately and start role playing, but no, there were in groups. There was getting tested. It was an amazing phenomenon at the time, and I loved it and hated it. But
it was super complicated, and of course, what is so it's interesting. I think that in the mush world, because it's all self-built, you could have amazing plots or none at all. Right? Like you could just have people just talking for a while, and then somebody makes some kind of drama here or not. Whereas I was on, when I did World of Warcraft, which I did from the beginning, like I played when it first came out for a couple of years, and then I stopped, and I was always on the role-playing server. And there wasn't a lot of role-playing because the game itself was so, like, well, there was a level grind, you got levels, you did these things in these zones, and you'd hang out in the inn and Goldshire, and maybe there'd be some RPing, but, like, it wasn't like in the Mushes.
Yeah, it's very different. Sorry, I'm just thinking, like, there was, like, because I actually wonder how many people that were in the Mush world migrated into the online world of the WoWs and the like,
or maybe Second Life.
In Second Life, because I'm thinking about the terminology that evolved with each one, and there are different words to explain the very same thing. Like, I'm gonna go there really quick, but, like, for example, there's this term called TS, and which is called teeny sex, which is effectively cyber sex. And then, but if you talk about it in the WoW space, is ERP, but they are interchangeable. MAV is another one, yes. And it's like, and I'm just thinking about that. It's like there like how the meta society was built up are very similar, but it's almost clear that some of the people who built these foundations did not do one or the other.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me to thinking about sort of coding and creation. That with there was an MMO called Tale in the Desert that allowed you to build your own houses that would be persistent. They would be destroyed if you didn't log in for like a couple of months or whatever. But most of the MMOs, you don't get to create your own things. But with the Mushes, you built your own apartment. Like, you'd have to get permission to sort of have a space, but then you built your own apartment. You made all the objects in it. If you wanted to do that, you didn't have to. You could be apartmentless. But like you were able to craft your character the way you wanted. Like, you just coded like your own little world that was part of this larger shared hallucination. And
that's actually
yeah. No, and I was just thinking about the ways in which that gives you so much agency that you don't get right in a standard MMO.
So I'm gonna there's something that I learned from Jordan Wiseman. So for people who don't know, Jordan Wiseman was the creator of Shadowrun, of Battletech, of Crimson Skies. He's done a lot of things for the tabletop space over the last 20-30 years. But he's always asked if he had a limited amount of funds, what he would make, and he would say nothing, because constraint creates creativity. And I think about this when we talked about Mush Space, because the reason why it works so well is because you had all these technical constraints, and so you had your imagination run wild. And I think that's why, in the way, WoW and those online ones don't work as well, is because you have a lot more fidelity, a lot more options, a lot more breadth of spectacle, and so it takes the onus away of the individual. Though on the opposite side, the reason why you can't own all these buildings, all thing, is technology, is instancing. What takes only a handful of bytes on text is a huge server load when you're talking about actual physical space. And then you talk about, if there's 10,000 people in your instance, how are you going to have 10,000 houses?
Yeah.
And there's some solutions, for example, like Black Desert Online. What they do is that there's the same physical location, but there's like sub lots in there. So you just enter your door, everyone enters the same door, and then it has like a directory of go to this particular house. And that's how you get around it. But it's still an ongoing problem of how do you get personal space in a world that has to cater to thousands upon thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tale in the Desert, Death Star Taco knows it, because it had lawmaking that got voted in or passed by other players. I think one of the ways that Tales in the Desert did it was because it was just so small. Like, it was an MMO, but it was not WoW. You know what I mean? It was not that many people.
I mean, it's. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say it's a fascinating problem to think about, because I think to this day, I think very heavily about macro roleplay. And by that, I mean being able to rope in over a few dozen people into a shared space, and how that can be done systemically, and how it can be done, because usually at the end of the day, it's done by brute force. It's that you get a legion of GMs that work together, and it's a production nightmare. It's a person, there has to be a coordinator, there has to be a manager for it, but is there a way to actually codify a lot of these systems so you can have this shared world? And I think much is for that. And actually, I think that's part of my professional goals because of that.
So tell me, so you go to the school to learn game design, because you were doing a lot of StarCraft at that time. You mentioned the tome, and I know this marks me as old, but it's fine. I miss the little handbooks you'd get in your video games, or even just getting packaging at all. Like, I mean, I miss the little guide so I could be like, what are my commands? This is what they are. Here's some lore. Like, I miss that.
Yeah, I very much miss it too. But there's two realities that happened to it. One is the internet.
Yeah.
And two is the internet. And that actually means double-sided coin. So there's kind of two halves of it. One is that physical products are extremely expensive, and you have to get products to shelf at a certain date. You have to be done with it months in advance, which leads to design time. And as Lizzie can tell you, logistics of physical goods is a nightmare, and which is why we got more and more digital. And it's just cheaper to do it that way. On the other hand, the things I remember that I loved, if you see back there behind me, that Diablo guide, that's a Brady's Game handbook of the best way to play Diablo. The moment it's printed, it is now out of date in today's world. There's a better FAQ out there. There's a better wiki that has a better way to beat the system. And so they got driven out of business.
I always got the ones for the Elder Scrolls games, because the Elder Scrolls were so huge as open world games. They would give you like a really great setup. You're like, what do I need to do in Morrowind? Okay, thanks, right? Like, I found that very... And there was something kind of cool about getting that big, huge, massive tome for your game to sort of sit through it and figure out, like, oh, I didn't know that was there. Yeah,
I miss that. I miss it, and I miss, and this is lack of self-control. I'll say I miss the feeling that it's okay to fail and okay to explore. When I go into the game now, because there are resources available to allow me to min-max and allow me to know the most optimal path, I will take the optimal path because that's what I'm compelled to do. And even when I want to be like, okay, I'll be in the optimal, I'm going to go there. I feel like, honestly, that I feel penalized by doing that a lot of times, especially as a person that doesn't have a full amount of time that can do replays. And so I miss the days like when I didn't have the option. Like when I had to do it on my own, there was a certain freedom in that because I didn't need to do the homework. I can just do my best. But now it feels like I have failed somehow personally by not preparing for it properly.
It's weird because I find that I have this habit that's probably a bad habit or a great habit. I don't know. Where the minute there's some kind of groupthink that shows up where everyone knows this is the best way to do it, this is the best build, really you have to do this build, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about builds in MMOs or what classes are the best classes, what race class combo in RPGs, or even in card games. Like if everyone says, oh, well, you know, there's no point in playing this kind of deck in this game, you got to play this one. I never do it then. Like the minute that deck becomes a thing or that strategy becomes a thing everyone does, then I just don't do that one. Like I'm like, I want to do something that's good and interesting that's not what everybody says is the one.
You know what Lizzie would call me if I said that?
Tell me.
Hipster.
Lizzie, you're going to call us hipsters?
I am totally the same way, though.
Yeah. Desar says, yeah, gone are the days for LucasArts, Sierra, online 900 phone tip lines. We did Torrance Passage with Google. Yeah. And the thing is, I am kind of anti-meta in a way, right? And the thing is, okay. All right. So I play Game of Thrones, the card game, and some other card games. I don't play Magic, but games like it. And I know people who will net deck. They'll get like the deck that won Worlds, and they'll just play that one, and then they'll win. And I always feel like, well, what's the point of that? Like, I didn't build that deck. I don't feel like I have any accomplishment if I pick some deck that everybody says is the best one. I want to pick something that I think is really cool and interesting and fun, and then I want to see how good I can get with that one. You know?
I think there's honor in that, and so I'm getting back into Magic the Gathering now for a little bit in paper because we have a coworker who has a bunch of palettes that he just is giving away to people as long as we play in house. But I also got started with Magic Arena, and it's weird because I feel like the core of Magic the Gathering is construction, is making your own deck. But now I've been fully realized that since the 20 years since I played, there's such a thing as a meta. There is a best way to play. And it's disappointing in a way because I remember looking at the World Tournament last year. And of the top 10, 9 out of 10 used pre-constructed meta decks, and only one was the mad scientist who made his own.
But you know but here's the thing I'm going to say about this. And like, that's what everybody says. Like, they're like, this is how it is. Everybody knows, da-da-da-da-da, right? But here's the thing about a meta. And maybe this is just me being I don't know, hopeful or Pollyanna or silly. But I feel like if everybody does the groupthink, right, then you should be able to be like, huh, if you're all going to do that, I can do this. And like, whoosh, psych you out.
I can actually go depth about this because this is actually a part of sports psychology and actually esports psychology as well, which is called execution and creativity are actually two ends of the spectrum. And the thought is that if you follow meta, you don't have to worry on the theory craft of it. Instead, you take what is known as good and you perfect it. You grind doing the same thing over and over again so that your body and your mind by rote knows every single permutation of the way you play this. And so you're never surprised by something new happening. The result of this is that what you can call mechanically, you're going to be proficient. You can do everything to a very high level of execution. However, it means that there are very clear win and loss conditions. On the other hand, with creativity, you are making your opponent have to improvise. You have to make them guess. However, it's higher risk on the other.
Yeah.
So that's why you often see meta, because creativity ends up being a higher risk, higher reward style play, because you are adding chaos to the element. You are trying new things that are not as known quantity. And so when you talk about competitive, the competitive scene, it's actually important to execute. It's not about fun anymore. It's about winning. So I can fully see why you might not break the meta competitively.
Yeah.
But that said, I'm playing for fun. I mean, I'm not trying to win every game.
Hi, Mr. Awful McPerson. And for me, the thing is, I want to win. So I'm going to tell you one of my glorious moments, and it's going to be super nerdy and be like, what are you talking about? But it's fine. I'll try to describe it in a way that will translate. There are many cards in the Game of Thrones that people think are not good. Or that, like, you know, those are not good decks, right? And they're sort of decks that people have dismissed some time ago in the past. And I went to one of the New York tournaments with all these like world champions. It was like a big tournament. And I put together this deck. I also would hamstring myself quite a lot that I would try to put decks together that were canon, right? So it's a Game of Thrones. So like I wouldn't have two characters who in the books would never like each other in the same deck. Why would I do that? They don't like each other. So I put together this Sand Snake deck for the Dornish, and nobody thought this was a good deck. And when people did Martells, there was one thing they normally did, but they didn't do what I did. And I come in and I'm like, I'm doing my thing, and people think that I'm probably just not very good because I'm playing this one Red Viper that's not a very good Red Viper, and I'm just playing my deck, and people think that I probably don't know what I'm talking about. And then I'm just like, and by the way, I bring out my entire deck right now, and they're like, what? And then I slaughtered people left and right. And the only reason why I didn't make it into the finals was because one of my meta mates who knew exactly what my deck was, we ended up playing each other, and he's like, no, I know what you're doing. I'm going to stop that one. And so he stopped me, and I couldn't get into the finals. But I was prouder that I almost just made the finals with this like wacko janky deck that nobody was expecting, rather than playing like, because like it's no fun when everybody's playing the same deck and you play like 30 games and it's the same deck.
And this is the other trap of the meta that reminds me, when the person was like, wow, you could do that? That tells me that they probably are doing meta because it's good, not understanding why it's good. And you can go because you are a musician, you know this. Yeah. And like there's a certain level of mastery. You need to understand why the masters do what they do, why they have a style that they do before you craft your own, which is why you have any teacher for music, art, anything that is creative. They tell you, you imitate, you learn, but you don't just do it because it's good. You have to understand why it is. And once you understand those foundations, that's when you can craft away. And I think even if you're just having an understanding of the game itself. Yeah, and by the way, hey, jank players in chat, all the jank. And I think that this is, and I think this, and Baron was right, because if they don't know what's happening, they can't beat the unknown, right? Yep. And it's funny because sometimes it's just this simple thing. If everybody, and you know, side note, this is, I think is really interesting. This is how I know like some of the theory crafting isn't what people think it is. So we have this meta here in the US that is like the best decks, objective true, right? And then what happens is that some European player comes over and wipes everybody's floor because the Europeans don't play the same way we do. They have a different idea of what cards are good and what are not. And then all of a sudden you're surprised. You're like, oh, I thought nobody was doing big characters. Oh, but apparently you're doing big characters in Europe and we weren't ready for it. And so just like knowing that these things are
like that there's a kind of like a like there's like the improv of jazz right in that moment.
Yeah, I can totally see that, and like it's funny because you're talking about that in cards. One of my passions slash obsessions, which I'm trying to get off of, is League of Legends, and the exact same thing happens is that you have different professional regions, and you have a person that's a master of a particular region or a particular play style that works in their local region, and they go a different one, and it gets slaughtered, and it's not even slaughtered by like the best team; it's slaughtered by like the fifth place team because it just is not a matchup, and then usually inevitably what happens is that there's two things: either people adapt or they go, oh, this is better over here, I'll take that instead, and don't realize maybe it was a matchup situation and it's just like grab. And so even in the best levels, like reactionary is a thing, is that people just make instant assumptions without really diving down. And this is why I think competition in general is fascinating, because it's a mind game more than anything else. It is learning people. It's learning people, it's learning traits, it's mastering strategy, and then execution. Execution is actually the smallest part of it. I mean, it's a huge part, but it's still probably one of the smallest parts, because everyone, this has table stakes. You have to be mechanically good, or you have to know the game well enough to get to this level. And then from there, it's just everything else.
Although, you know what I find it often is the big difference between the person who does and doesn't win? Different elements. Did you make mistakes, right? Like, because with a lot of these tournaments, you're playing for 8 hours, right? Like, you've got 6 games of Swiss, and then if you make it out of Swiss for those, so that's like 6 and some hours there, and then you've got the semifinals and finals, the cut and all that. That's hours of playing your deck. And sometimes the difference between winning and not winning is, did you just misplay right there? Did you forget that trigger? You know what I mean? Like, sometimes these little, like, not even like big errors, you know what I mean? Just like little tiny errors where you didn't optimize that one because it's been 6 hours, and then you just lose that sharpness of your concentration, and then they eat you.
And that's where the opposite of creativity comes in with execution.
Yeah.
Because if you had drilled that, and I'm talking more for like sports where you will practice for that. Yeah. If you have done it 1,000 times, then it doesn't matter if you're tired or not mentally, because your body and your memory knows just by this nature, if A does B, do C, which could be a trap. But in that case, exhaustion doesn't matter anymore, because you've done this situation so many different times. So that's like the constant balancing act. You should never be on either of the poles. It's all about the nuance and the context. There's times to be creative, and there's times to follow standard meta. And it's finding what the right situation is for the thing. And if you get locked in one or the other, you're probably going to lose. Desar
Taco is pointing out that Go in Japan was all symmetrical, and then things changed when Chinese masters showed up in Japan way back when. So thinking about competitive gaming as cultural exchange, which is so interesting, because actually now I'm thinking about chess and the ways in which, sort of different chess styles, or even fencing styles, like all these different sort of competitive styles, when you get regional styles, and how that is some kind of form of cultural exchange when people meet. That's interesting.
It really is. And I don't know, and I've seen like this in what I watch, usually the most competitive and the most like clashing styles that go against each other are the ones that have the most respect when it's over. It might be that one stomps the other, but usually that's when they have a better appreciation for the other culture. It's a really strange thing, because like I've seen people that watch, this is going to go with like the basketball, and it's a very physical game, and people are violent on the shelf. And when it's over, you see them hugging each other, and this like, you are amazing. And it's like, there's something about the intensity of finding another master who's playing a completely different way of thinking, because it changes your worldview in a way.
I also really like, if the difference between, let's say, for example, college and professional, right? The ways in which people play differently. More strategy versus more individual stars, and just like both in basketball but also in soccer, actually a lot of sports, like there's like the different sort of way of going about it, and both of those are really interesting to see. And part of it is when you're a college player, you are still young. You know what I mean? Like if you're a professional, that's what you do all the time, right? And you've got years playing that game, and so you have different kinds of expertise. When you think about somebody who's like, you know what I mean? Like that big star who's been professional for 10 years, they have a kind of ease and skill. They get to do certain things that maybe you don't do when you're just that plucky team in college and you've not been playing as long. But I like both.
I do too, and I think because everything's connected. That's why I always say with like we go back to meta again too, and
Yeah.
that's why you often see meta slaves is what one word is. Actually, think about that. That's a terrible term.
Yeah.
But for people who are just clinging to professional metas and they don't understand the level of execution required is extremely high,
Mm.
and then once you go to a lower level, like for example college, it's going to fail because you don't have that skill set necessary. While something that might be professional weak is easier to execute,
Mm.
and that's why I love watching it, because the strategies change, because things can be more exciting. Like I've often I heard people say, only watch the top tier of this. Everything else doesn't matter. And I'm like, no, you don't see the full expression. You only see one way.
Mm.
That's like saying, I'm trying to think if there's a music equivalent. I'm just thinking like, go see only Foo Fighters when you don't want to see a garage band. And it's like, no, the
Yeah.
garage band's going to bring something else.
Right. Something
Like-
that maybe you wouldn't have expected.
Yeah.
You know, here's a thing I was thinking about. So I'm thinking about loss, failure, and tabletop RPGs for a moment, and then also video games. And also card games, right? So when I first started RPGs, and I'm going to ask you, when you first started tabletop RPGs, one of the things they told me in the beginning was, this is a game where nobody can lose, right? There's no winning or losing in tabletop RPGs. You just find out what happens. And I internalized that really young, like, oh, this is a game where you don't win or lose, you just sort of find out what happens. And I feel like when I'm playing a competitive card game, I have sometimes played games with people who will quit, like after the first or second rounds, especially online. They're just like, oh, you're going to win, and so they quit. And I never quit, even when I'm being stomped, because I always feel like I've got something to learn. Like if I'm being completely stomped in a game, I'm like, okay, I'm going to play this out, even though it is doubtful I'm going to win, although you never know, because I know I'm going to learn something from this process, right? Like, what is happening here? Am I not able to get cards out fast enough? Like, do I not have the draw? Like, what is this? Or is there a way that I might be able to learn how to pull something out in the middle of what seems like despair? And so, like, I've always been very fascinated by those games that are hard, and seeing how I can pull myself out of it rather than just quitting because it didn't fit. Like, well, I need to get this card in the first round, and then I need to do this, like, and if I don't do those things, I'm not going to win, so I quit. Because, like, maybe you can still win. I don't know. Like, there's a particular kind of adaptability that I've always found interesting in playing games.
That's interesting, because I'm the opposite way, though now I'm questioning if that's the right way, which is I am a big fan of go next. And by that, I mean, if it's clear that I'm losing, I will forfeit, or I'll encourage my team to forfeit, so I have the next game to play. And that's for time efficiency's sake. I only have so many hours in a day, and I want to maximize that time, which can be a trap in two ways, or in several ways. One of them is that you don't get that situational awareness. So what I tend to do is that if I feel like it's a casual, or if it's a game that doesn't have stakes to it, go next. And then when it's competitive, fight to the end. If it's something that has stakes to it. However, it does hamstring me away, because it means I don't get the breadth of experience needed for comebacks.
Yeah.
It's like, there's going to be times where you face adversity, and it's not just about will, it's about tactical understanding of taking instead of taking the 50-50 play, take the 30-80 or 30-70 one, where you're likely not to proceed, but if you take the 30-70 versus the 10-90, you're at least a little bit more likely to come out. But if you've never been in those situations, you don't know what the odds are for those two plays.
Yeah, and sometimes there are these decks that are really strong, but then they peter out, right? So that they look overwhelming for the first 3/4 of the game, but then they can't finish. And if you quit, like at the halfway mark, you actually might have been able to take them, right? Like, I've been in those moments where I was like, oh my gosh, you've got like 12 points and I've got 2, and you only need like 3 more. But then they stall out, and I was like, oh, I'm coming back. You know what I mean? And then you can overtake them. So it's interesting to sort of see where that happens. So tell me, when did you first start with tabletop RPGs?
College, actually. So this is gonna be a little bit sad in a way. I've been buying role-playing books since I was about 8 or 9 years old. I would buy the books and I would just read them alone. I never actually had a tabletop group to play with in real life until I met my friends in college. And so my first time actually doing real roleplay was in Mushing. And that's not really tabletop. And so my first game I actually played was Deadlands, which is why it, for me, is my favorites. I mean, there's a lot of problematic elements. It's My box is at work, but I have the 20th anniversary with the Jack Daniels box that comes
Wow.
with. I'll put it on Twitter at some point. It's amazing.
Please do.
But I love that system because it was the first time I really got to experience kind of what it's like to roleplay. And I never got the warning about like it's not win or lose games. It's try it, you might like it.
Yeah.
I went in completely blind. I mean, I had experience role playing before, but never really role playing with a rule set, and it was amazing. And that's where actually my first character death was in Deadlands, and it was a PC. Oh no, yeah, the first one was a PC death. Like a PC killed my PC,
Oh yeah.
and having to navigate the bleed of that,
Yeah.
because you get angry, you get visceral. It's like, why in the fuck are you doing it? It's like I was just playing my character, and to him, he didn't think it was a problem. And eventually we sort it out, but there's all these things you just never really learn until you try in real life.
Yeah. So this is really interesting because I imagine you have a lot to, like, I'm interested in your thoughts about rules, death, failure, games. We're in a bit of a space where people are thinking, oh, well, you shouldn't have death or failure. That's not interesting. Or actually even a lot of rules. Let's slim all that down. And I love some rules light games. I love them. But there's also something very satisfying about some crunchy stuff. And there's also sometimes satisfying about failure. And like those things are also interesting. I was wondering what your thoughts are about that.
I think there's space for all of them, first of all. And I think it more important than anything else is having table consensus. Having a session 0 or even a pre-session 0 discussing what are the goals we want as a group, because there's no worse feeling than feeling like you've been blindsided. Either you think you're going to crunchy and it begins to be a very airy and light, and that's role-playing heavy and you don't feel like you're comfortable as a role player, then you feel odd. Or it might be that you want to have these great narratives and then your character dies in a role. And there's no worse feeling because then you have heavy bleeds. So I think the first thing is group consensus. But from there, I very much think that the entire spectrum is important, which is why a lot of what I've been thinking about and a lot of my design has been going more into the Nordic realms. And Nordic LARP is about experiencing negative emotions as much as positive. Strix got me onto that, actually. So thanks, Strix. You ruined my life. Anyway, because I can't actually do one thing, it's impossible for me. I have a second game I've been working on, sort of this formula in the back of my head, or actually I have two of them. One is kind of interacting with death and guilt of death. But the other one I've been really wanting to work on is called Wedding Crashers, which is about a group of friends that are going to a friend's wedding, and all of them have unresolved tension in some way or another, and it's all randomly drawn. And it's about dealing with death of relationships, of infidelity, of these negative emotions. And because I've been thinking about it, like, in media and in my experiences with roleplay, you only ever play the good side of things. You only ever play a very linear track of attraction, the flirtation, and eventually getting together. And then after that, it's usually happily ever after. You very rarely see the trials and tribulations of an extended relationship. Of what is it like to maintain? Because that is its own story of its own. What happens when it ends? And not just badly. What happens if two people fall out of love? And I've been thinking a lot about, like, how can this be role played out in a place that can be safe, and how can it get rules behind it? Because bleed is a really real thing. But these are the types of games that I've been drawn more to lately because it challenges me. And this at the point in my life I am right now, I'm less inclined to play the hero's journey. I've done that a lot. What I want to do is play at failure, play at these hard things. I say often, like, my favorite times when I'm in live stream and doing these games is when I'm uncomfortable. Like when someone challenges me, like I'm expected to do something. So like, Prey for if anyone watched Eat Pray Kill on Geek Space, Prey was the epitome of me doing the wrong choices, the choices that I wouldn't do. And in fact, I had an active thought in my head of, this is not the thing I should do. That's usually what I leaned into. And oftentimes, and this is going to be a little bit cheated, people watch the show, I often roll success and I will purposely fail, even though I said I succeeded. And I know that's a no-no for you because I know you're pretty...
I don't fudge.
I know you don't fudge, but in that case, I will always fudge failure. Like I will never fudge turning a failure into success because I think that's just disingenuous. But there were just some times for the narrative where I want to explore what happens when I don't do the right thing. If I don't jump across that chasm and be the hero? What happens if I fall in the middle?
Well, see, then I just wouldn't roll. If I want to fail it, I'm just not going to roll. I'm just say I don't make it. Like, that's what I want to do.
That's a fair way of doing things. Sometimes though, and this is more for the drama side of things, and I think there's this term I've heard, and I think it's very applicable. It's about Critical Role, where people say Critical Role is D&D as porn is to sex, and by that means it is as performative as it is real. And I think to a lesser extent, all live streams, any game where you play for an audience, is performative because that's what you're doing. And so there is a theater of rolling the dice. Otherwise, you lose the mystery of, oh, this is improv. And there's nothing wrong with improv. In fact, I love improv, but some of the appeal of it is that there's an element of randomness in it.
It's interesting because I mean, I have a lot of my Sal mentions that system mastery is also satisfying. And Javai says my group always has the rule that you can always choose to fail any roll. And I think that's a good,
I love that rule.
That's a great rule. Like, you can,
in fact, do you mind if I steal that? Because like, I think that would add so much to live games.
Yeah, I think that's great. And if we know it, then we're all there. And what is interesting is that, so about the Critical Role is to gaming is porn is to sex. It's funny because that has Critical Role is very similar to how my games off stream have always been. Because I always played with theater nerds, right? So like, it's interesting. People say like, oh, that's not what Critical Role is not like what gaming is like. Now, Critical Role now is a little bit different, but Critical Role in the beginning was very much like what my games were like. Now they have a minis budget that is not ever where I was at. And also it was more like, dry erase maps and markers.
Yeah. So I would even say though, back then though, those are all professional improv, so there was a degree of theatrics that they always have, to their credit, and I think they've done a masterful job of using the skills in their civilian life,
totally,
so to speak, to make it more approachable and I think they have, that broadcast has brought a new age into tabletop. It's like it's brought so many people who otherwise would never be there. So not saying that as a negative thing, but I think it's a good point when I talk about, I will fudge numbers, especially negatively. I would never do it the other way because I think that's just bad. But I will fudge to make it a better experience for the audience. So, and some of that is requiring the roles. So
now Sal says, see, the trouble with I choose to fail is that usually the character doesn't choose to fail, and it feels disingenuous to the character to fail intentionally. And I think that depends on where you're sitting, right? Like if you're sitting in a sort of a method actor space where you're inhabiting the character, then choosing to fail doesn't make sense. But if you're sitting in a narrativist space where you as a player are not your character, you are sort of piloting your character and you're sort of thinking in a meta space, then it does make sense, right? Like a lot of the narrativist games, you are simultaneously playing your character but also playing the world. And so as a player, you're often making choices that are not in your character. So like in those games, it totally makes sense that the player chooses to fail, the player chooses to use fate points, or like there are a lot of the games where like you are always functioning on a meta level that, because you don't inhabit the character in the same way, right, in those games.
I have to think about that more, because I think that I've experienced both of those things. Like, there's sometimes I was extremely method and I felt extreme amount of bleed. But there's sometimes I had to divorce myself from the characters to make kind of decisions to how to guide the plot as a whole. And often in the same episodes. Again, I'm talking about live stream. Like my offline time is completely different. Currently, I'm playing a lot more casual games, a lot more crunchy games. I'm trying to get more roleplay heavy group in, but that's actually surprisingly difficult to do. It's weird. You need the right people for that.
Well, this is okay, and this right here is goes back to a thing we're talking about, Critical Role, right? So I've had groups that were just like Critical Role, even though we were offline, but those were special. Right? Because it's all about what group you have. I've also had groups where none of that would ever have happened. Nothing that happened on Critical Role would ever happen, because that is not what people wanted. What they wanted was a really good tactical battle. And that is all they wanted. And they would not have conversations out. You know what I mean? Like, but that's also a game style. Like all these different, and I think, my opinion, that the problem with Dungeons and Dragons it's not really a problem, it's a challenge, is that everyone thinks they know what Dungeons and Dragons is, so no one has the conversation. Like, the Session Zero thing is not part of Dungeons and Dragons culture, because everybody assumes they know what the game is, but there are multiple different ways to play that game, and oftentimes people don't have a conversation about what is the way that we're going to be playing it, and that's a shame.
It is. And this comes to the very interesting conversation of hacks versus systems. Because, like, I think people should have a very honest conversation when and this is talking about Session Zero again, is talking about what your intent is for the game, what the GM's intent is, and what the player's intents are, because that will determine whether the vanilla version of the game you're playing is the right one for you, whether you need to have a different system entirely, because there's some things that are actually hand catered for what you want your experience to be, and there are times the hacks will work just fine, and I think a lot of times people kind of go in with a preconceived notion of, I want to do this exactly, and let's bend the system to do what we want, or we're not going to have the conversation like Succession.
Yeah.
I don't really care about that, but maybe player A, B, C do.
Yeah.
So we don't have the conversation. Then when we get to that point, it's, oh crap, now what do we do? And so, like, a lot of prep work, and I don't know, like, the more older I get, I feel like tabletop is about homework more than anything else. Yeah.
I also think, and this is Jevai says, that is made even stronger considering how altered D&D turns in some groups, and so much homebrewing often gets right. And I would say this thing is interesting to me, that I think there's so many videos out there for DM advice, right? So much DM advice on the internet nowadays. Not a lot of player advice. And I think that that's a shame, because I think something that is really important is for players is to really think about what it is they like and want. And if you cannot articulate what you like and want, then it's actually sort of difficult to do an effective Session Zero. Like, do you like PvP or not? Do you like it to be funny or not? You know, like, really thinking about the things you want in your game. And a lot of players have never thought to articulate what they want, and that's like an important skill to cultivate.
It is. I think, and like, now that you say it out loud, like, I feel like there is a need on an internet for this, because I also think to a lesser extent, when people's gateway is D&D, that's all they know. And I think we're hitting a point where it's become a conflict of either you're D&D or you're anti-D&D. And it's contextual, and I think having a way to explain of having a conversation, feeling what's comfortable for you, and then determining what's the right system, because I think that will be the key to having a good long-term game. The one that's getting bodies in the table, that's actually the biggest trouble. It's like getting people to do it consistently is very difficult as adults.
So this was another thing I was thinking about in terms of expectations. Something that the group that sort of opened things up for me was my group that I had in the Army, where it just so happened we had 5 of us were GMs. Where like it was like somehow we got a group of people who were all forever GMs. Like, we'd always been the one who were GMing all the time, and there were 5 of us. And so what we ended up doing was, basically, I would run a game until we finished the adventure. So for like 10 sessions maybe, and then we'd skip over to somebody else's game. They would run for like 10 sessions. And then the third person would run theirs for 10 sessions. A fourth person would usually jump in for 10 sessions, and we'd come back to me, and I'd run mine for 10 sessions. And we just sort of like alternated through. And what was really valuable about that was GMs pitched games to players. They said, like I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing an espionage game. Would you like to do an espionage game? And people would then buy in and say yes. So you'd have player buy-in for the game, but oftentimes you'd say, like, okay, I'm thinking either an espionage, I might be wanting to maybe do Deadlands, or I might, like, as a GM, you'd throw out a couple of things saying, like, this tone, this is what I'm thinking about. Players would decide what they wanted, and all of a sudden there was a kind of a buy-in. But also it wasn't going to be a game that was going to last 10 years necessarily, or you were not committing to 10 years. And there was something about that conversation of what kind of game do you want to play that oftentimes wasn't had. You know what I mean? It was just sort of like, well, we're just going to go into play D&D, but there's never any kind of choice from the player side, or even sometimes from the GM side, where the players would say, we want to play D&D, and the GM might want to do Deadlands, but they can't, right? So some kind of way to have, like, this opening up to have, like, a conversation about what we're going to play and how, even before we actually get to Session Zero. And then also the sense that we don't have to, this game does not have to last for 50 years. Like we can play for 1 year. Like, you know what I mean? Like we can play for sort of slightly less time and then maneuver and do something different. And that I think is like, that is very valuable because it puts a lot less pressure on people, makes it easier to be consistent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think there's like kind of a couple things you touched on. I think one is comfort of group.
Yeah.
Like if you know each other well, you're much more comfortable asking these questions.
Yeah.
I think one is experiential. Like you will probably go with what you know most, either as GM or as a player, and you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Because maybe if I'm playing Deadlands on Life and someone comes in with Call of Cthulhu,
Yeah.
and I'm like, ooh, tentacle monsters. But then I actually play and it's, oh my God,
Yeah.
insanity is great.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about Marcus's posts.
So good, right? The weird owl, creepy. I love it.
Creepy owl. So it's part of it's experiential, and then part of it is a supply and demand thing. Is that I feel I'm a Seattle-based person, and the tabletop scene here is vibrant. But I go back when I lived in Iowa City, and I literally had no one.
Yeah.
And when you're in a dearth of players or GMs, you take what you can get.
Yeah, it's true.
So I think all those combined to be so, which is why I love like the Roll Forwards, the Roll 20 app, and having online groups is super important because that allows you to get the right group together that's right for you. And I think as you're talking about actually having these player videos are important. Another thing I loved was Strix's weekly affirmations.
Oh, so good.
That was among other lessons, it was a primer on all the different games that are out there. Is that there's something about having a taster's menu. This is not going to be committed for the next 10 weeks. You get to play it one time.
Yeah.
And you could play for 10 weeks, but no, first let's just try this, and this. Let's go through all of them and then make your decision. Because I think having the knowledge and the context of what's out there will really give you better informed decisions. Because I feel like who I am now versus who I was 10, 15 years ago are completely different. And I can say I want to play Soldier. Now I know offhand there are 5 systems.
Yeah.
Off the like this back of my hand that could cater to this. And I was like, what type of soldier do you want to play? Do you want to be gritty? Do you want to be a humorist? Do you want to experience it in a near-death experience?
Yeah.
Let's go deeper than that. But if I would say 10 years ago, I'll be like, let's D&D and let's reskin it.
Yeah. And what is interesting, I think this is so fascinating, in going back to the importance of Critical Role for a moment and things like it, is I think one of the biggest barriers for people getting into role-playing in the past was that there was no other hobby like it, so you didn't know what it was like. Right.
Yes.
And so you're like, well, I don't know what it's like. I can't conceive of it. And if I don't know anyone, like, how am I supposed to do it? But now you can just watch a session and then you can see what it's like. And then maybe you might be bold enough to try it yourself. You know what I mean? Because it lets you see. And I mean, I learned about so many games through weekly affirmations that I didn't know previously. And it's like now you can like learn about new games you hadn't seen before. You can know there are other things. And I'm really excited that the Critical Role people are doing other games besides Dungeons and Dragons. Like they just did Call of Cthulhu, they've done Honey Heist, like different systems to introduce them to people because they've got such big reach. And like it's good for people to know that there are options.
I mean, I think the option is the key, which is why I would say that I should never be anti anything unless it follows one of my like no-nos, because there's definitely systems out there that are either technically less well done or they have problematic content. So setting those aside, I think nothing should be off the table, and it should be up to the group to decide this works for them. And you should never ever shame another group for what the decisions they make, because it'll work best for them. Yeah.
And also what I think this is also, also I think this is really an important thing to say. I think that we ourselves are not static, right? So I like certain things, but I can like other things too, right? Like I'm not a monolith, right? So I tend to like heavy RP games that are serious. Those are things that I tend to like. But you know what? I'll play a dungeon crawl, right? I was playing Ghosts of Saltmarsh on the Greyhawk channel, and that's like pure dungeon crawl. I'll play like a goofy game. Like I will play different things because I'm not only one thing, you know?
Yeah, I 100% agreed. And it's also with the people we play with too, because I know, for example, I do a lot of context switching. Like the group I play with offline at work is a very crunchy team. Like is about dice, is about we are the D&D group for there. But like if I talk about the offline when I want to play with Lizzie, or if I want to play with Strix or Jackie Dash or any one of those people, I will go for more role play heavy because that's where we came from, and I'm more comfortable with that. But like I wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily doing improv with my other group
Yeah.
because that's not what they're doing, and I might feel either I'm making them awkward, and
Yeah.
I might feel awkward doing it. So, you know,
Yeah.
you have to have permission for kind of choosing what's comfortable with that situation.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes it's easy, and this is something, you know, there was a moment that I was playing in this D&D group, and I was just not having fun because it was too crunchy, it was too combat oriented with almost no RP. And please note, I like me some crunchy combat, I really, really do, but I did not find D&D 3rd edition's crunchiness to be interesting. Like I found the mechanics too swingy, like it was like a flat probability curve, and I didn't feel like there were enough interesting tactics. So for me, the combat wasn't interesting enough. It was like crunchy and full of combat, but it wasn't interesting enough for me, and I was very dissatisfied. And I was, you know, but there was a moment when I was like, oh, but you know what? There's nothing wrong with them, right? The problem is that I'm not happy and I'm not saying anything about it, right? You know, like the problem is I need to be in a different group, or I need to accept that this is what this group is and just adapt to that, right? Like there's nothing wrong with what they were doing. And once I sort of like flipped my head around and also found some other groups that were doing some RP stuff so I could do both, then I was fine. You know what I mean? And I think that becomes the thing. It's if you don't like it, like maybe you don't like it because that's all you have. Maybe you don't like it because it's not your thing. Maybe you might like it in a different context. But there's nothing wrong with any of those things. It just may not be right for you at that moment.
100% agree. I think to add on top of that really quick though, too, is something I think might be obvious, but I just want to say it anyway, which is never suffer in silence and actually communicate with the group, because
that's right.
You might feel like you're doing a disservice to someone by like your GM by being like, yeah, that's great when you don't like it. But ultimately, if you just silently leave, then they're going to be like, why aren't you showing up anymore?
That's right.
Why are you taking, 3 or 4 other people's nightly time for 2 or 3 hours?
Yeah.
You're not going to be there.
That's right.
So it's like communication is key for both good and ill. And it might cause some friction at some point, but all you're doing is forestalling a bigger friction later by not talking. So like communication is key. It's a relationship, like, and with any relationships, communication is the goal.
Yeah, and I think that was that was wrong of me back then not to express my feelings, because that was dumb.
Well, it's awkward. It's honestly awkward. Yeah. It's like, because the first thing you think about is, oh, I'm going to offend them. They're my friend. I don't want to say I'm not enjoying it, because they're going to say, am I not good enough GM? Am I doing something wrong? When it might not be them. So I can understand, like, it's a natural response to often try to save others' feelings by suffering in silence, but ultimately doesn't do anyone good.
Right. And the thing is, maybe everyone's feeling the same way. You know what I mean? And I actually...
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I'll say, like, I've actually played a game where someone finally was like, you know what? I didn't like that last scene, or the last game session that happened right before the TPK. Because we all made bad decisions, but we all made bad decisions thinking that's what everyone else wanted. Then we had the conversation like none of us wanted it.
And I was actually thinking about, you know who I think suffers in silence perhaps the most? GMs. And I think that's where you get all of that GM burnout, because GMs are not having a good time. But what do people tell GMs all the time? What is that thing you hear all the time? It's GMs are happy when their players are happy. That's all a GM needs to be happy, is that the players are happy. And then GMs burn out and stop running, because sometimes your players are happy, but you are not happy, and you don't feel like you can say anything. And I think that I think it's just so important to communicate where you're at, how you're feeling. Are you feeling good about it? On both the player and GM level, and I think if there's not enough player advice, I think one of the things that I think is really worrisome to me about current GM vibes is that GMs are expected to sort of be service only with no sense of self, right? They're like, just make the players happy no matter what, and then you've got it.
I think there's a weird dichotomy going on, which I don't know if it's been studied or is textual yet, but there's actually a separation of GMs. I feel like there is the home GM, and then there is the advent of the professional GM.
Yeah.
And by that I mean if you watch any live stream, especially the bigger ones,
Yeah.
that's a paid service. They
Yeah.
spend a lot of time and a lot of effort making that right, and
Yeah.
some of them do it as a service for other people. When it's your job, that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
That becomes a service base, but that's their decision, and that's what they're doing for a livelihood, and that's a conscious decision. That's not a responsibility for a home game.
That's right.
And I feel like maybe there should be some studies on it, or at least some documents to teach people that. Again, we go back to the porn versus sex analogy. Is that performative does not mean you do this and it doesn't work for you. You need to realize that just because you see on screen and you see this is how they do things, they do it because they are very cognizant of audience and their player needs, and they are service givers, but that's not necessarily the role of the GM.
Right.
The GM really is the facilitator in a lot of times. And if you want to be a part of the story, then you should talk to your group about it. Or you should look at systems that don't require GM at all, because there are those out there, or have rotating responsibilities of the GM. So,
or that what that GM's responsibility is a little bit different in this particular game. And Barantor says, GMs can be having a terrible time and feel like they're letting the players down if they want to quit or reorient to the game. Yeah, and I think, and I think, and Critwitch says, I try to tell my GM thank you and great job as much as I can without making it weird. As a GM, I appreciate it very much whenever that happens, because I will say this, I don't know what you think about this, AJ, but I find that being a GM is really vulnerable, right? Like, it's a very vulnerable position because you are really trying so hard to make sure that everybody's having a good time. And especially if the players are not especially communicative, then you have to like figure out and intuit what makes them happy, and you're spending a lot of time doing that, and then you don't know if you succeeded if they don't tell you.
I don't know, like, so I'm usually a player. I'm very rarely a GM, and I find like a best GM is like a therapist, a babysitter, an antagonist, and your best friend all at the same time, and they switch at a drop of a hat. And it's just like, so whenever you find a good GM, I'm just like, thank you so much. But it is hard because you have to take all those things into account, and even while you're telling the story, it's like I'm speaking, but at the same time, I am actively thinking and looking at all your reactions, and I have to swivel at a drop of a hat, because you might not say something, but if your eyes droop a little bit, maybe I've done something wrong.
And you have to be aware, right? Like, see that whole table. Which, side note, which is why I like to max out at 5 players, because I feel like as a GM, I can pay attention to 5 players' emotional internal state. But when you have 7, it's a little bit hard.
I was about to run a game offline for Deadlands that had 9 players in it that we're gonna have to, just for sake, split into 2 different groups. But there was a short period where we're gonna think about trying everybody in there, and I was like, I can't do this. There's no way. Like, and it's also disservice because no one has screen time at that point. But oh my god, I'm trying to imagine trying to keep the fun level for everyone so they feel like they're all invested. That's a hard task, and I think there's some people could do it, but I think what would end up happening is that it would lean more towards the crunch. It would be dungeon crawls, that nature, and tactics based things. I think for role playing, it wouldn't work as well.
And then,
but
then I would also say, just adding on to that for a moment, that I think that there's talking about player skills again, right? There's a player skill that a lot of players do not develop that they should, in my opinion, and that is making their own fun. Right? Like, and I think that, for example, there are some players, because of, like, maybe it's because of modules, I don't know why, who are there to receive fun. And they sit to receive the fun, but they do not actively create fun. And it's a good skill to learn that as a player, like, if you like doing certain things, you should actively seek out the fun and also try to give fun to the people at the table next to you. Like, try to make sure your friends are having fun. And those are sometimes, I think a lot of players are taught to be really passive. And to sort of get players out of a passive mindset, I think is really important.
So I can say this from personal experience with some past traumas too. I think the passivity for some players can come from a fear of GM. Is that there are GMs out there that will punish you for making the wrong decision or ridicule you for being silly and wrong. And if you get one GM like that, it will scar you for the rest of your tabletop life. Where
It's
you're
true.
just like, I will not be proactive with it
Yeah.
because if I make the wrong choice, then the rest of my session or the rest of the
Yeah.
entire season is ruined.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so like I've actually, like, a lot of people are passive. I found have had that GM
Yeah.
or if they had other players be
Yeah.
like, oh, that's stupid.
Yeah. And so
Um,
then that's where being a GM is a part therapist, right?
Yeah.
So like I find was like, because I love doing sandbox games where the players have a lot of agency to do things that they want to do, but I also find that a lot of players have never had the agency or not used to taking it or might be traumatized. So you have to like do the therapy to bring the players into a space where they can feel like that it's okay for them to you know, make choices. Like it's okay. You don't have to try to guess what I want you to do. You can do what you want to do. It's okay. But like that's a process of trying to get them to sort of come out of
yeah, and it's not an easy thing.
no.
Um, Iffy just said something very interesting, which is as a player, you got to be able to hand over the mic and then learn how to take the mic.
Yeah.
Spirit of the Century, which is a game by Evil Hats,
Mm-hmm.
is a fantastic way of doing this. So Spirit of the Century is a pulp novel 30s where you're playing like a pulp superhero. And during character creation, one of the things is that you create dime novels. And part of the rule is that you create a dime novel and the person to your left is a guest star of it. And you're a guest star in someone else's dime novel. And part of the mechanics of getting people to have those relationships is to learn to be both in the spotlight and also to be secondary to someone else's spotlight, and how does that interact? And I love that mechanic. I haven't seen it many other places.
Yeah, I think
I just bring it up.
I think it's pretty core to Fate. Like I think that's part of Fate character creation that you always do that. So that's pretty good.
That. Yeah, and it's like, so I always love to look for games that have mechanics in it to learn how to share spotlights and reward good interaction and collaboration. Because it's not a natural skill. Like it took me a long time because I'm going to talk as an American here really quick. We are an individualistic culture. You've learned that you should be the star, that you should take any opportunity to shine your own light because no one's going to give you anything. And so kind of instinctively, we grow up to be, if it's my time, I'm going to take it. And it's very difficult to give it up. And I made a lot of mistakes, especially role playing, because I came from playing video games alone. And then it was when I was a young adult, like I was 17, 18, when I first started interacting with other people in a shared environment. By that point, I'm used to being the star. And there's nothing worse. There's no worse feeling than realizing that, hey, look at that asshole over there taking all the light. And then it's like, oh, wait, I just taken twice as long as them.
Yeah.
Am I the asshole?
Yeah.
It's a terrible feeling.
Hey, Atomica. And it's interesting because I think about this actually, think about these sort of like skills, right? Player skills, which in terms of like sharing spotlight. And I was thinking about, so going back to something you said earlier about Nordic LARP. And I personally, I've been thinking a lot about experience, right? And people say things like, well, what people want, right? Everybody wants, and the minute somebody says that, it's not going to work out well. But the current conventional wisdom is that nobody wants bad things to happen. Like everybody wants escapism, to be a hero, to like do the great things and win. Like this is like the thing. And I was like, people also,
I contest that.
Yeah, I contest it too. Like people also like horror films and like melodramas where they cry all the time. Like people also like sad things. They don't always like that is one story. The story of like Dirk Beefcake who goes up the mountain and destroys all the things and wins all the time. Like that is one story that some people want, but some people also like tragedies and they also like horror. Like they like all sorts of different things. And I think catharsis is so important in games. Like I remember certain moments in my video game life where I'd play some video game and like I was devastated in the best cathartic way, when I was like, oh no, I can't save all of the people, what do I do? Right? And that was great. Like, and there's something really beautiful about being able to finish a game and sort of cry about the sort of like the state of humanity or the beauty of life or something, and getting just something a little bit different. And I think it's important to remember that escapism is not always escaping to like a perfect utopia. It can also be escaping to something else.
Yes. I mean, that's definitely why I play. Is I want to live in someone else's shoes for a period of time. I want to take what you said though and just kind of grab and turn on its head a little bit and use another everyone, even though that's a naughty word. It's everyone. But I think when people say that everyone wants to have a happy ending, is that nobody wants to be blindsided and feel like their investment has been wasted. And that's what happens is when you play the hero, you spend X number of sessions and you don't think that death is on the line and it happens. That is a terrible feeling. But if you go in and you have the conversation of this is a possibility, prepare yourself partially for it.
Yeah.
That changes expectations in the way you approach the game.
Yeah.
Is this that surprise and a negative surprise? Because sometimes you do like to be surprised.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a GM, I like being surprised, right? But I think it's so important. Like, so, for example, I don't think that death has to be on the line, but I think you need to know if it is or not, right? Like, if I maybe we're gonna do a 4-color superheroes game, and I just want you to know there in this game there won't be no one's gonna die, and there's not gonna be like we're doing real 4 colors, so there's gonna be no torture, right? Like. None of that, like, and now we know what the shared universe is like, and then we jump into it and we know what we're playing. If, on the other hand, we're going to be running like a real 20s pulp superhero thing, then it's going to be a little bit different, but we need to know it. And as long as we know it, then I think that we can be comfortable. You know what I mean? Like, I think that you can relax once you know. There's a certain
It's like the sorry, I'm thinking about Arya really quick. Gigi Soda on Twitter. She was a co-star with me on Eat, Pray, Kill. But she's very heavily into consent culture, and she does this professionally as well. And this is what it comes at the end of the day, is that there's implied consent and there's explicit consent. And when you work with people long enough, you can kind of go into applied, though a lot of the experts in matter says you always have check-ins and you should constantly have that communication. But if you're in a new group and you're with new GM, you need to have the explicit guardrails of consent and culture. And it doesn't always have to be about, you know, when you think of consent, you think of things like physical intimacy and contact. Sometimes consent is the ability to interact with a character that doesn't belong to you, to experience emotions that you might not expect, and to engage in certain levels of dialogue, which is why, for example, the X card is a great tool. Like, I don't think I will ever play a game without an X card ever again, because that offers an easy out if you make a mistake. But having ground rules will prevent you ever from needing it. So that's why I say it's an everybody rule for that one, because I really think when people say everyone wants to be happy, they're really saying no one wants to be blindsided unless they have consented to such a thing. And also, like, not everybody does, right? Like, well, let me put it this way: some people are happy with sad things, right? Like you know, like what happy is sort of different. Mr. Alpha McPerson says escapism has become a red flag to me due to it becoming an excuse not to hold bigots and fascists accountable in TTRPGs and in storytelling. And that is that, like, you have to be careful, right? Because sometimes it's true people will use escapism as a way to excuse gross behavior. Krellin says, my escapism is escaping to a world where good intentions and good deeds are rewarded, not punished, where bigots and fascists are punished and overthrown, right? And, like, some people want that escape. They want to go escape where this is what happens. Other people want to go to escape where they really deal with loss in a way that they couldn't do in real life, you know, or with struggle in a certain kind of a way. Like, there are different things that people want to escape into. And I just think that, like, it's important to, like, be upfront about what one wants. It's all about the conversation. And, like, I'll go back to really quick. There's another show in Geek Space called Manner of Speaking, which is Regency era. And we had to have an honest conversation early on, because if you want to have a realistic Regency era game, is it Regency or is it Victorian? I think it's Regency.
Regency.
It's Regency. Then you're talking about affluent white people with men in power. That's the honest truth of it. There are very static roles which you can play in that particular society. So then you have to have a conversation. In my escapism, are we trying to have a realism of that? Or are we going to say there is no such thing as sexism or racism? For some people, that is actually erasure. You're saying that the struggles of the people that era don't matter because it's my fun. Other people, it makes me uncomfortable to experience it. And there really, honestly, is no right answer.
Yeah, that's right.
It's really what's up to the comfort of the group. And as long as it's thought about, I think that's the most important thing, is have the honest conversation.
But I will say about the Regency, side note, that sometimes our sense of the past is actually inaccurate. We're like, well, realism is, and I was like, well, hold on a second. England had people of color in it during the Regency era, right? And including people of color who had money, like, you know, and people were able to maneuver around things in certain ways. And I think that sometimes, which is why, for me, historical games are so important, because people will sort of create a fictional history that is super oppressive, more oppressive with fewer possibilities than actually happened. Like, people did stuff in the past, people, you know, and it's not unrealistic to have women who do something different and who sort of maybe cause a scandal. It's not unrealistic to have a rich half black, half white British person whose family work plantation owners and has a lot of money and status. Like there's a lot that you can, and then also maybe you set the whole, you know what I mean? Like there's like I want to challenge what people's thoughts of reality are, because it's often not real what they think.
I completely agree with this, and I kind of oversimplified the issue. However, I will say as a converse to that is that oftentimes we talk about remarkable individuals is within the context of the society, which is unusual.
Yes.
And it often becomes one of the primary themes of the game or the presentation you give.
Yeah.
And then you have to have the conversation. If you have, for example, the black character in a society that is primarily white and they are the aberration, that character is actually going to get more spotlight than others. So you're going to have the conversation is this okay?
Yeah. But then also what I think is really funny is that, like, Liverpool, for example, was super diverse during the Regency era because it was a major port town. So it wasn't like there was only one black person in Liverpool. There were lots. And I think about, for example, in France during the Revolutionary War, there was an entire regiment full of black people, right? There were enough black people in France to have an entire regiment fighting for the revolution. And I think that people sometimes do not recognize actually how diverse the past was, and sometimes it wasn't nearly as remarkable as we like to think of as it now. And I just think that we just have to
I'm gonna have a really weird
bit.
Side note really quick.
Please.
That I have to say, since we talked about the revolution, a little pre-revolution, post-revolution, Alexander Dumas, I did not know was black until I was an adult.
Yeah,
because of that, and the fact that he was buried outside the I forget what the street is in Paris, but it's just like these facets have been effectively erased.
And his father actually fought in that black regiment, right? Like,
oh yeah, no, he was a commander of it. He was Napoleon Bonaparte's one of the most trusted advisors until they had a falling out.
Yeah,
there is a novel. I'll find it and I'll link it on Twitter about Alexander Dumas's father, because he is the person who the Count of Monte Cristo was created out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pumpkin, like Alexander Dumas Black, like there are so many people in the European history that were people of color that are just erased. And so like it was so funny. There was a Three Musketeers film that came out and it had like a person of color in it, like maybe a black person. And somebody's like,
that was one on BBC.
Yeah, and somebody's like, that's so unrealistic. There weren't black people back then. It was like Alexander Dumas, who wrote the book, was black. So like your idea that there were not black people back then is just not true. And just like thinking about like challenging history through your games is also a thing that you can do. And I think, because I basically worry about the ways in which people will create these really terrible pasts that were like clearly not, like, there are bad people everywhere and bad times everywhere, but people functioned. Do you know what I mean? Like, people actually did function. And don't use your game as an excuse to bully your players. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, definitely say so. And I think you touched on another topic, which I don't know if it's proper for here, but we should definitely do it soon, which is talking about the right people for the right roles of GMing.
Yeah.
And this one specifically, I talk about things like, what's it called? Seventh Sea, what's that samurai game?
The Legend of the Five Rings.
The Legend of Five Rings. And there's others where you're talking about cultural appropriation to the point of fetishism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, who is the right person who can probably tell those tales?
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a minefield that people avoid, because it is a minefield, but it should have a really deep conversation about it. And there are, if you go to Twitter, and in the scene, there is some deep conversation about it, but I would love to have more about it because I have opinions on it, because, and part of this is upbringing. And I think one thing that we have to, I won't say forgive ourselves, but we have to be cognizant of is that you're going to always like problematic content.
Yeah.
It's impossible to live in this society and not like something problematic. What is the problem is that if you excuse it because you like it, you have to be able to criticize your content consciously.
Yes.
I say that because sorry.
I also think that, for me, there's a difference between I really like this thing, it has some problematic elements, and I really like these problematic elements. Because I was like, hold on, what are you doing? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there are things that are really good that might have some problematic, because everything has something problematic in it, but there's also people liking things because they're problematic, and those are different things. You know what I mean?
Those
like, if you're like, yeah, I want to go and play Deadlands because I really, and you're like, nope, pause. Like, because you can play Deadlands and work through it and try to find a way to do something to make it work, right? Or you can perhaps like it because like gross things about it and make it even grosser. You know?
Yeah, I've been there before, and that becomes super awkward because then you have to have the real conversation of, is this a person you want to interact with even outside the table?
Yeah,
because
that's right.
Oftentimes people are revealed when they're most comfortable.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
right. Yeah,
is that everyone? I mean, I have it on my tattoo here. We all wear the mask, so to speak, and we change our masks based on our context. And so, the more guarded you are, the more likely you're going to create a facade that matches what your needs are. As opposed when you're relaxed and you think you're playing the game table, you can find some really uncomfortable things or delightful. But in this case, since we're talking about uncomfortable ones, and that's when you have to really take a conversation with them and be like, is this what you think? Maybe we shouldn't do this table. Or if we do interact, let's go into a safe space where it's impossible to really hit these boundaries again.
Yeah. Like, with you, I'm not going to play this game. Like, I will play this game with you, but not this one. I have a question for you. This is because you worked on Shadowrun, the Shadowrun games, and that's like a dystopian future with a lot of different themes going on, and cyberpunk as a genre in general has been going through a little bit of controversy.
Cyberpunk is dead. Sorry, I've heard that a lot lately, but I just had to say that.
I personally don't think you can do cyberpunk anymore. Not really.
It's an interesting debate because I know what people are saying when they say cyberpunk is dead, which is that cyberpunk was established and created in a very particular zeitgeist, which was the 70s and 80s, and it was a dystopian near future, which was heavily affected by current themes, especially of the Cold War and late capitalism is really starting to bloom.
And now those things have come to pass.
Yeah, we're living in this dystopian future now. We haven't hit the full mark of it, but our perceptions of what it is have altered our views in our fiction.
Yeah.
So, though that said, I like the term cyberpunk as a general catch-all, which is why I'm going to go into when we talk about feminist circles about waves. And so I would like to have embrace of maybe saying second wave cyberpunk or third wave. And so that way we can be very differentiating where first wave was very much this time and place. Yeah. Now let's go to the next one, but it's still, because if we kind of break down cyberpunk, you're talking about, realistic technology where you ask the questions of humans and their relationships with society, especially corporate society, and their relationship with machinery. And that's kind of where the core themes are. And if you say that cyberpunk only exists in the 80s, then what do you call this new era? Because those questions still are very relevant. But now we need a new label. Yeah.
So it's interesting because what you're saying, I totally get it. And I'm down. I buy it. I will say that what some people said was they'd go with transhumanism rather than cyberpunk, sort of going from sort of machine man to gene splicing and being a little bit less dystopian about it. But I actually like the idea of multiple waves.
Yeah. I actually would contend that's not necessarily cyberpunk.
Yeah,
it is not a heavy element.
Yeah,
but you can be transhumanist without being cyberpunk at all.
That's right.
There is a very evocative feeling you get when you say cyberpunk. That's when you think of the Blade Runners of the world, the Shadow Runs, the Snow Crashes.
Yeah, that's right.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So which is why I would like to reclaim that word and say that cyberpunk is not dead. Wave 1 is far dead. Don't try to be wave 1. Be wave 2, wave 3.
Yeah, because I think one of the problems is, this is why I think waves is really interesting. And this is when I go like this, right? When what it seems like is what they're doing is wave 1 nostalgia that is not actually relevant to the current day, right? When they're like, hey, you like cyberpunk in the 80s, here's a retread of 80s cyberpunk, but it's lost all of its political bite because you're actually just kind of doing the 80s again. If you're going to do it music. Now, right? I want it to be relevant to this moment. If you're going to do a thing, I want a second wave, right? What I would want is a second wave of cyberpunk rather than a nostalgia look at First Wave. Like, and I realize you're probably just trying to pander to me because I watched Blade Runner, but like I don't want to be pandered to with like 1980s politics. I want some present, like what was great about cyberpunk in the 80s was that it was challenging the current political moment, right? And I want my second wave cyberpunk to do the same thing.
So I'm going to say something that's going to be slightly uncomfortable.
Do it.
Because which is when Paul Ryan, if people don't know American politics, Paul Ryan was former Speaker of the House during the Obama administration and the early Trump administration. He said unabashedly and unironically, he loved Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah.
And if people don't know, Rage Against the Machine is a very anti-establishment rap group, metal group, rap group of the 90s. And it's like pretty much the antithesis of what he is.
Yeah.
But I think that is a perfect encapsulation of what we talk about in cyberpunk and to talk about nostalgia plays is that you don't like the movement. Yeah. The movement actually honestly doesn't matter at all. It is the evocation of themes and feelings that it gives you. Yeah. And people remember cyberpunk, they remember the Blade Runners, they remember the feeling it gives them and the majesty in the setting. Yeah. The message doesn't necessarily matter, which is why I think it's okay. There's a place and time for that. But to continue on the message, it has to go forward. It needs to push on the envelope because oftentimes those concepts are not fun. Or they're not fun. They're uncomfortable. They make you think. They make you honestly self-analyze that. Because usually when you're in a society, you're contributing to a lot of the world's society because that is how it works intrinsically. And so to think about it, you begin to self-reflect. Oh, I've done A, B, C, D, and that contributed in this way. And suddenly your game is not as fun anymore. It becomes a tool of self-expression and self-realization. Mm-hmm. But that's not why everyone comes to the table. But I do think that's a very important piece of why it exists. Yeah. Krellin says, one big problem with cyberpunk these days is that it originally explored a world where Japan became the predominant power of the world, but that reality never happened because cyberpunk happened before their lost generator in the 90s. Yeah, and I think we need a new version that acknowledges the experience of Japan in the 90s, right? So that, and I think this is, well, actually, there are a number of things that I would hope that a second wave of cyberpunk would actually be more global in its mindset, not just looking at Japan as the outside threat, but actually having Japanese creators and then also Chinese creators and Indian creators and like really trying to sort of their lost generation try to create a really global, thoughtful sense of what, because here's the thing, it's 2019 and we live in a globalized world, right? Like we have all, like Valken says, we are the outside threat, right? And I think that we have to sort of think of we live in a globalized space now, right? So I think that a second wave of cyberpunk would have to be more globalized, right? And the other thing I'm thinking of is that I'm thinking all these concepts of cyberpunk and how they are commonplace and they're easy to understand for me now in this culture. Like, for example, globalization of corporations and corporations becoming their own sovereign entities is a common theme. Yeah. And I feel like that is almost inevitability in our society. But I bet you 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that was radical. Yes, and I think I'm not capable of that. I don't think I am such a avant-garde thinker to really think what's next. But I think that second wave needs to push what is possible and actually make it plausible, because those things were not when you think of science fantasy, for example, that's just making things up. Yeah. But actually looking at the trends and going, okay, this is where we are headed if we're not careful. Right. And I can't actually properly forecast. And that's why I want my next cyberpunk to be, is this is the danger of the Black Mirror, so to speak. Yeah, because cyberpunk is cyberpunk as a dystopian genre is a warning, right? It's like saying, hey, we need to pay attention to privacy issues. We need to pay attention to what happens when corporations get more and more power. We need to think about environmental destruction. It's a warning, and it's a way to sort of. You just made me think of a really good game idea where it's cyberpunk because it's not really radical, but playing an agent in a world where doing any sort of transaction puts your data onto the net, and that's loss of self. So you can do anything you want, but the more you actually use the grid, the less you become yourself. Oh, that would be a fun game. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. And I agree. I think the first wave of cyberpunk is dead because it doesn't make sense to me. And I think that I think there's, okay. So
Work with me.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1950s, rock and roll was pretty radical. It was doing its thing, was pretty radical. In the 1970s, when all sorts of old boomers are like, let's listen to rock and roll from the 1950s again, that was no longer a radical thing. Bringing back 1950s music in the 1970s was the opposite of radical. It was regressive.
Yes.
And I think that 70s and 80s cyberpunk had a lot of radicalness to it. But if you just do 70s and 80s cyberpunk today, then it's no longer radical. And then it's not like, it's not doing anything. So I think the idea of doing a second wave where you really think about, okay, what are the dangers of the time we live in now? Like, that's interesting. That's interesting.
It is super interesting. And also, when you talk about regressive, what scares me even more, and I'm going to throw a slight bit of shade over to Project Red really quick.
Do it.
Which is 2077 that's coming out. Scares me a lot. And I love Mike Pondsmith. He was, like, personally to me as a Black man, having a person really being a pioneer in tabletop space is inspiring. But there are very problematic elements of cyberpunk. And actually with Shadowrun as well, because you're talking about transhumanism of losing self by changing your body. Which hits home very, very firmly to this day and age. And I think as a creator and an author, you have to be cognizant of your current station and current politics and adapt the media to that. And I'm really afraid that a lot of people that go with nostalgia bids don't think about that. They just think about, let's stay true to the original message. And that message has changed. And it's a scary message now.
And also the message might have meant something different then than it does now, right? Like when I think about like cyberpsychosis and some of these mechanics, it was not about prosthetics, like medical prosthetics. It was about the fear of cyborgs, right? Like it was but that is not how that is read anymore, right? Like we are now in a different space completely, and it's not good.
And though that said, it can live beyond just cyberpunk because, for example, if people watch my Twitter, I'm excited about Wheel of Time. It's about to come out. I was actually really scared for the series at first, and then I've been announcing the cast, and it's extremely diverse, which makes you super super excited. Like Nynaeve and Perrin are both people of color, and it just makes me really happy. But there is a very scary thing about what's it called? Sorry, brain fart. Real Time and Robert Short's vision, which is that it exists very much on the gender binary. Is that magic exists as a male aspect and a female aspect, and it has very distinct things. That was created in the early mid 90s. And it's a very different time and place. And I want to see how they adapt that, because I don't feel comfortable keeping that as I did as a kid, because that doesn't exist for me anymore. Like the spectrum is what I exist in now and what I perceive. But that's another example. That's fantasy, and that doesn't have the context of time. But now that I'm speaking to a modern audience, it's to adapt.
Mr. Awful McPherson says there's also the great problem of ignoring the threat of eugenics and transhumanism in cyberpunk. Definitely. And so I think that we have to, and I think it's interesting because there are things that were once radical but are now not, or were once not but that might now be, and we have to be really aware that we are making art in a time and place. Right? Like, and that is this time and place. And we can't pretend. Let me put it this way. If you don't care about what anybody thinks about your art, then don't show it to anyone. But if you're making art to show it to other people, then you kind of have to care about other people in some way. You don't have to, like, you still do your thing, but at least be aware of the time and place that you exist in. Hey, Ice Bunny. Hrothgar says, when I read the Wheel of Time series, I didn't picture any of the main cast of characters as white. Some of the major support characters I pictured as white, but I viewed most of the characters as Middle Eastern.
That is super interesting. And so I've read the series twice, once as a child and once as an adult, and I could completely misread it, but I always felt that Robert Jordan did a good job with being very open to multiculturalism. I think that's one of the things. I think he had a lot of issues when it came to gender. I think especially female characters, the Acidae in particular, are problematic because they lean very heavily into the Bene Gesserit side of things. But because I had in my head, because of the covers, I definitely saw the main characters as white or white passing, but a lot of supporting characters, a lot of the ones that were brown people. And then I actually found out later that Robert Jordan himself thought if anyone watched the series, there is a group of an empire from across the sea that's way more advanced than any of the other ones, and they come to invade. Those ones were almost like exclusively by black people that were, and they're way more sophisticated, more, and like this was revolutionary time, but I wasn't even aware of that. But that's how he captured it. So I'm just really happy because I think it's so very easy, and I go cough Game of Thrones to instantly whitewash fantasy because that's kind of the default.
Yeah. And sometimes the work isn't supposed to be whitewashed than it is anyway, right? So I'm thinking about Wizards of Earthsea when they made that sci-fi adaptation, or wherever they made it from.
Awful.
Yeah, and like Ursula K. Le Guin was like, "This is no," and you know, it's terrible.
And one was extra egregious because it's actually textual, and she made it a point to say that. Wow, I forgot the main character's name. Oh, I'm a bad nerd.
Chat, help us.
It's a bird name. I'm looking it up. Wizard of Earthsea.
Sparrowhawk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Falcon.
Is a dark-skinned person.
Mm-hmm.
I feel really bad about that because Wizard of Earthsea is actually my favorite book. It's what I read. Lord of the Rings before that. I read Lloyd Alexander's Book of Three before that. But I would say that Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea made me fall in love with fantasy. And I know, and it's really weird because I'm in a geek space, and in general, most geeks in my circles are more sci-fi bent than fantasy bent. I'm the opposite. I'm way more fantasy bent than sci-fi. So I don't know if you read this, but I don't have the books unpacked. That is my bad. And maybe I should find them and take them on my vacation so I can read them. That would be great. I should see if I can find them in the next 48 hours. But I read this interview with N.K. Jemisin, and I was like, oh, I need to get this woman's book and then read it. So I got the book. I've not yet read it because of my life, where she was talking about how the problem with fantasy, because she writes fantasy, is that many of the setups of a fantasy setting is that there's a status quo, and then there's a threat to the status quo, and the heroes have to stop the threat to the status quo. And then she said, as a woman of color, the status quo is rarely good for me, so I'm not interested in making fantasy novels where people are just there to uphold the status quo. She wants to make fantasy novels where that's not what's happening. And I was like, oh, I want to read your fantasy novels and see what that's like. That seems really exciting to me. She is fantastic. I have a couple of her books back here somewhere. And I need to read Fifth Season, especially now that it's becoming the game. But
yeah, that's what I need to do.
I'm excited about that. But
yeah, and so I think that there's a way in which I agree with you that a lot of people will go to science fiction because the future seems so exciting. But I really believe that the past is so important. I wrote an academic article about how multiculturalism in the future is not sufficient if you keep a whitewashed past. Because the past itself is where people often sort of make claims of who is a real citizen and who is not. And so if you have a whitewashed past, then you are creating, like, no matter how much multicultural futurism you get, you're standing on sort of corrupt foundations, because people can always turn around and say, well, you're a newcomer, even though that's just not true. You know what I mean? And so I actually think diverse fantasy is really important. I think it's really important.
Super important. Like you talk about regression. If you control the past, you control the future. So even if you have that multicultural future, if you get populism and you say, oh, this is actually abnormal.
Yep.
And the past shows that, yes, eugenics, this is the right way of being. Yep. And you control that narrative, then it's a lot easier to sell that message.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Mr. Offenly person's like, the fetishism of monarchies and enlightened absolutism is something that bothers me greatly with fantasy literatures. Yes. And I think that's really important. And there's one thing I will say in Game of Thrones' the book's favor is that George R.R. Martin does not like monarchies and enlightened absolutism. He thinks those are bad systems. And he wanted to make those things seem bad. And he also doesn't like war, so he wanted to make that seem bad. And I appreciate that was in there because, right? Like that's... Like, we should not be longing for the days when we have absolute monarchies justified through the divine right of kings. Like, that's not good.
That's a yikes. That's what I say.
Right, that's a yikes.
Jera had a good one. Would you consider the last decade of Hunger Games a new wave of punk? There's actually a term for it, which I can't remember. I want to see if Lizzie remembers it. But there's a term. It is called punk. I think it's called suffering punk or survival punk, something like that. But people have coined it as such. Um, I, I kind of, I wouldn't say take umbrage, but I stifle against those because a lot of those books and a lot of those series are riffing off of other media and other topics that have already been explored before. For example, Hunger Games is a direct ripoff of Battle Royale, which in itself is a ripoff of the what's that called? The Greatest Game, which was a 1930s short story.
Yeah, that's right.
And they've expanded upon them, but these are not necessarily new or radical.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's why in the case of Hunger Games, yes, ish.
They're going with like the I think the reality TV sort of element becomes important right there, bread and circuses. But the thing is, it was like what the Divergent series, Hunger Games, the Maze Runner. There's like a wave for young adults who are interested in darker themes, and that's interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think there's a place for it in the world. But that's interesting when you mention punk because, like the way I am kind of visualizing this is in the expression of art and furthering a political message.
Yeah.
But then you go look at steampunk. Steampunk has no political message. It is a theme. There are political messages in it, but when you say steampunk, you're actually talking about an era in which steam technology is the primary method as opposed to normal electricity.
Well, it's interesting because Krellin, we could talk about Danny's complicity in the time of the Dothraki, but the thing about, because I was just running a steampunk game and they're talking about the punk and steampunk, and sort of thinking in terms of punk, part of punk is about class distinction, and steampunk has class distinction all over it. Now, how much you lean into that becomes a bit of a question, right? I mean, because it's Victorian, so there's a lot of is your steampunk like woo? Yeah. Lindsay Ellis, I watched that one. I haven't
watched it yet. I watched part 1. I haven't watched part 2 yet. So
I need to see part 2. I watched part 1 as well. I just want to have lunch with Lindsay Ellis. I want to have like a long lunch with her and talk about everything.
She has awakened my desire to learn more about film theory because honestly, I would be completely like blunt in saying I never had an interest in movies and TV as a media that I wanted to contribute to. And after watching that, I was like, wow.
Yeah.
It's like now it's gone from like I don't want to do it that I don't think I have the mastery to ever get close to that because so many mediums and so many it takes from writing, it takes from photography, it takes from audio design and all intermesh. And anyway, side note, but yes.
But to go back to that note, I do want to ask you a question because I want to come back to this because I'm interested in this. You have worked on some amazing games, and games are also a storytelling medium that have their conventions and that have like work put into it in terms of themes and right and like ludonarrative dissonance or or consonance. There's like a lot. Like games are really fascinating, and you work on them in these really exciting ways, and you work on games that mean a lot to people, that people are invested in, that have a lot of lore in them, that are doing things thematically. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about like what it means to you and what things you're doing in those games. Like, do you have, can you give us some behind the scenes sort of like authorial thoughts about Battletech and Shadowrun?
So I will start at the beginning saying that I am not a writer on Shadowrun or Battletech. For that, we have an amazing team. Andrew McIntosh does a lot of the primary writing for those 2 titles. I'm more on the technical side, but I think on a studio level, what we kind of conceive of ourselves as stewards. We're in a very unique position with Harebrained Scheme where we're taking loved traditional games, things that have had an established space, that people have a good idea what they are, and bringing them into a new era, and also modernizing them in some ways and paying homage to them in others. And nothing we do is taken lightly because every step we take, we have to be mindful both of the past, of that it might mean something to you, but it might mean something way more to the person who grew up with it. It might be their lives.
Yeah.
It might be something that they've established their identity with, and you better respect that.
Yeah.
Whether or not you agree with it. But at the same time, you cannot be untrue to yourself and what your vision is.
Yeah.
We are a relatively progressive studio, I would say. We have and we very much have pillars of what we want to have in our media and what we want to explain. We don't want to idolize things that we find negative.
Yeah.
We want to expose what we think are bad society traits, and really take a deep lens to it. And so you have to have respect and conviction and a certain amount of bravery, I would say. And by that I mean if you just take that piece of media and just bring it into the new age and do nothing with it, I think you have failed as an author. You have failed as a creator, because all you're doing then is just taking a coat of paint, taking the shine to it, and it's really the previous authors, the previous engineers who have done that and recasting their vision. You have an obligation to push on it, and that's never safe. And if you ever feel like you're doing something safe, you've done something wrong. And I feel like I'm confident saying that's how we approach Shadowrun. That's how we approach Battletech, is pay it a deep respect and try to modernize it and try to make it into something special and set it up into a place that the next generation will take it further. Because I think it's hubris and I think it's foolish to ever think that we are the last people who are ever going to do Shadowrun, that we're the last people who are going to do Battletech. There's going to be another studio that does. There's going to be better other authors that can do it, and they're going to hopefully do it better than we did. That we are just a block, a stepping stone, so that we can create this deep universe, this one that has affected so many people's lives, and just make it better. And I think if you keep it that way, if you you don't keep it as a relic, and you don't keep it as a precious baby.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't keep it as flippantly as a piece, as a can of Coke.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in between, and you just keep it going forward. And it's a living thing. It's like everything you do is a living document, and just treat it as best you can.
That's so beautiful.
Thank you.
So we're gonna have to go because it's like I've kept you longer than I should have. And I've
been enjoying this.
I know, it's so good, right? So good. And I just want to ask all the questions about all the things.
So here's what I'll do. I'm going to turn this around. If people don't know, me and Lizzie are going to try to start doing a podcast. Don't know exactly when. I'm not going to put that date out in the world, but we are trying actively to do something. How about you be our first guest for it?
What? I would totally be your first guest. Are you kidding?
Because then we can talk more, because I actually kind of feel like I'm talking a lot of my perspective. But like these things that we talk about now, me and Liz have on a nightly conversation about, and her perspective is so great. And it's like, I would love to have these riffs and have you as part of it. And then we can dedicate a little bit less to my perspective and more of this discourse. And I think that our community is great and amazing, and that we can talk about a lot of things for as much fun as possible. So let's not consider this the end of the conversation or talk. Let's just move it forward to the next one.
So what are you going to call this podcast? Do you have
I have a title that I really want to do. I don't know what it's going to be called, but I want to call it Bold and Bolden.
Oh.
Because it's Lizzie the Bold, and I'm AljernonBolden. So Bold and Bolden.
I like it. It also reminds me a little bit of what's the Brave and the Bold, right? That was that
was DC, right?
Yeah, DC, Brave and the Bold. Lizzie says, pulling the plug. Boldcast.
Bold and Bolden.
Oh, so good. Bold and Bold. I will be your first guest, no doubt, so fast. I'll even shave, although it's a podcast, so I won't shave my beard off. I'll just clean it up,
Fair enough. I need to clean mine, too.
Yeah, no.
But it's like...
Yeah. I need to clean it up.
The beard club has to remain strong. Don't shave it ever.
Oh, no. Horror. No, but I'm all messy right now. I'm scraggly.
So this is the last tangent I'll do about Eat, Pray, Kill. But season 1, so Prey is non-binary, and so one of the things I wanted to be more authentic about is to have more androgyny to it. And so I shaved completely off, and I had a lot of struggle because a lot of my identity is kind of tied around beard, and I liked the way it looked. And so when season 2 happened, I grew out my beard because it was a couple months, and it's like, do I want to shave again? And I had a lot of anxiety about it for, and it's like, no, beer is important to me. And then I had another thought, which is important to me on a one-on-one level of sexuality as a person who is largely cis for most of their life, which is being non-binary does not necessarily mean androgynous.
That is correct.
It does not mean doesn't mean you have to be either femme or het.
That's right.
It mean it's self-identity. But that was one, like, in that character made me realize that, like, I've heard of that, I logically understand, but to internalize and like the pressure I got from it is like, I want to be true to a perspective that is not naturally my own.
Yeah.
And then I have something that I feel might be inauthentic. It's like, wait, is it inauthentic? And so, like, insane, like, beer is important to me, and it actually kind of helped me realize more about the world around me. So,
can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Because that's amazing. Shaft, the original film, Richard Roundtree, he had a mustache, and the producers or the studio was like, "Oh, he can't have a mustache. That's too dangerous and scary for the black man to have a mustache in the film. He should shave it so he'll look a bit more respectable." And like the director and they were like, "No, I'm just not shaving the mustache off. It's not going to happen." And so then we get Shaft with this mustache, but the mustache itself was sort of kind of scandalous and dangerous at that moment. Isn't that interesting?
That's super interesting. I want like devote an entire episode to blaxploitation.
Oh my gosh.
It's like we touched upon it earlier when we were talking about cultural sensitivity and appropriation, and about like, for example, if I did a blaxploitation game, it might be very different than a different person running the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not their culture.
Yeah.
But I want to dive into that because I think it's a very important thing, because there's a lot of empowerment in there. But anyway, I'm straying off.
By the way, if you were going to do a blaxploitation game, I would be in it real fast. I'd be just like, okay, I'll be in it. And then just real fast, just so you know, I just line up to be in there.
I mean, a little bit Brother John Love is from blaxploitation.
So here's the thing I would say about blaxploitation films, and then we have to go, I know it, is that the thing is, my concern about people who are outsiders to blaxploitation, and not all outsiders will do this, but my concern is many people don't take blaxploitation films seriously. They think they're ridiculous. They're like, "Oh, look, the clothes are so stupid and crazy, and like, oh, they're so bad and they're so ridiculous." And I was like, no, they're not, though. First off, the clothes themselves were like fly and cool in the context of the era. So like, if you go into it as like making fun of it, that's no good. And these films were, and like, many of the films are really political, right? Like, they're really about police brutality, depending on which ones you're looking at, but a lot of them, like Shaft, was about police corruption, Superfly, like Sweetback, like, and they're often,
Sweetback.
Yeah, and like they're often like the equivalent of the Black Panthers in those films, and they're very political. And then, you know, Cleopatra Jones is fighting like corrupt police and heroin dealers in the neighborhood. Like, they're not frivolous, stupid things. They are actually quite meaningful. And if you don't get that, then I don't think you should be doing a blaxploitation RPG.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's like, I go to end day, it's like, do you have good feelings about the heroes of pulp?
Yeah.
Blaxploitation is pulp.
Yeah, that's right.
Is a modern era of that. And it's like, you need to recognize it as such. And it's very easy to, but it's hyper sensationalized for a reason. They did that as a point. That was not accidental. It wasn't like, oops, we made it funny. No, they went in very much. It's like, we are going to stretch the boundaries of this media. And partially, you know, we can go deeper about this because some of it was political and part of it was just to get it into the theaters. They needed to do such. Yeah.
And Mr. Awful McPherson notes, like, the Machete films are comedy while it's full of political messages and protests. And I think that, like, I think it's important to respect the thing, right? If you're going to do a thing, you need to respect it, and not in the like he kind of a way, right? You know, like, don't do a soap thing if you don't respect soaps. Like, soaps are doing a thing, you have to respect them.
I feel like if we encapsulate this entire conversation, it bubbles down to like communication and respect.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and consent. Like, that's all we've been talking about this entire time.
And I think knowing yourself, right?
Yes.
Look, you have to know yourself. There's a new version of Dolomite coming. What?
Is there really? I know there's the new Shaft coming out pretty soon.
That's right. 3 generations of Shaft.
Yes.
Just Pam Grier. That's all I need to say. Pam Grier.
Oh, I love Pam Grier.
All right, we're going to call it, because I'm not going to keep this man here forever, but I will be on Bolden or Pulling the Plug or the Boldcast or whatever that is called. I want to thank you so much for being here. You've been such a lovely guest, and I'm so glad that people could meet you. Could you tell us about the things you're working on right now and where we can find you?
Sure. So you can find me at AljernonBolden on Twitter. There you usually get updates of either my professional life as a game developer, talking about tabletops, or talking about politics. Otherwise, right now, I'm currently working on the next expansion of Battletech called Heavy Metals. Just look out in the news for that coming out. You'll get some more information in the next couple months.
What's it about?
Oh, Battletech?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Battletech is...
No. Heavy Metals.
You have to see.
Oh, I just thought I'd ask, and maybe I'd get like an exclusive, but apparently not. That's fine. You've got your secret lips on lock.
Love you, but
I was just gonna ask. If you told me, you did. If you didn't, you didn't. It's fine. But I'm gonna assume that Heavy Metal's about heavy mechs made of metal that also perform music concerts.
Okay, now I'm gonna steal the idea of having like a rock guitar, and that'd be a Sass effect.
Like, I'm just saying there could be a rock guitar in there. Just ponder it with maybe flames.
Yes.
just ponder it. And what else?
Anyway, aside from that, like I said, I am working with some other people in the community trying to make a new tabletop, Brown Down Gods. My goal for that, and I'll just say it out loud so I'm held accountable, is I want to take a game from concept to market completely. And this is mostly a personal exercise to see if I can do it. I have no expectations of it'll win an award or anything. I just want to give it a try. And I feel like we are in a privileged position, this era, that an individual or a small group of individuals can actually take a tabletop game and actually give it to the market and even print it for a relatively, I wouldn't say cheap. Cheap is not the right word, but for an affordable price if you know what you're doing and you get the right advice. That was impossible years ago.
Yeah.
You could only do it in trade shows. You could only do it. Now I can send it to the world.
Yeah. And
I want to see what it's like and to get better respect because I've been around great designers. So that's one of the other things I'm going to do. Otherwise, if you come to Big Bad Con this year, I'll be there. So say hello to me there. And hopefully I'll just be, guessing. And there is one thing I'm doing in the near future.
What would that be?
It might be something in Harlem.
What? DC.
It might be a little bit of noir.
A little noir.
And there might be Cthulhu.
So I have officially asked AJ if he would be the third investigator for Cthulhu Confidential, and he said yes. So I'm just going to say that there's going to be some Cthulhu Confidential with AJ and me in the future, just not in August. just not in August, but after August, hopefully September, if not September, early October. We're gonna work out our scheduling and Cthulhu. AJ, Marcus said that he would do video of you to do promos.
Really?
Yeah, because he does amazing stuff.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I need to rewatch the end of Claudia's because I caught the first one. I did not catch the second, and it was tense after the first. Oh my gosh.
I'm going to just say this. Claudia made some choices. They were amazing. And I was like, when you're like, how you're a GM sometimes? Sometimes you're a GM. And you're like, what do you do? And the person says stuff. And you have to be like, you cannot be like, wah! Even though on the inside, I was like this.
I feel like of all the players I've ever played with in role-playing games, the person that will always elicit the "wah" is JIKIDASH.
So good. I try not to go because the thing is, I want the player to continue doing whatever "wah" sort of thing they're doing, and if I go "wah," they may not do it. But so I want them to continue on. There were choices made. You should watch it. It was amazing.
I'm going to watch it now. I have to watch it.
Oh my goodness. No spoilers, but stuff happened.
I'm super excited, though, because I've been on a hiatus since January. I have not been in a live stream game since the beginning of the year, so it'll be exciting.
Yeah, we gotta fix that. We'll fix it.
Yeah, let's fix it.
All right, everybody. So all of you in chat, thank you all for being here. You all are wonderful. I'm Trooper SJP, and I have you can find me on places. I've got a bunch of socials here. This is them. Boom. So you can find me on, I've got a Discord you can join. You can follow here, like in the, there's a follow button somewhere, I don't know, down there. You can get me on Twitter at Academic Foxhole. I have a YouTube where you can sort of see the archive of all the shows. I also have a Patreon, which I'm building up to help go and support so I can get a weekly RPG with a cast that I can pay. So those are all the things that I've got going on because I want to pay casts. I want to give them money and so they can, I don't know, buy like a burrito. Like
it's super important. Like I feel like it's become commonplace to have live stream games, but it's a commitment. It takes a lot of work to do, and I have the utmost respect for people who do it consistently, and especially people who do as a craft, because it's really easy to phone it in, but to do it well, it takes a lot of emotional effort.
It does. Like it's a lot of emotional effort to do that, and it's also a time commitment, and it is work, and people really put their time into it, in both as a player but then also as a performer, and I just feel like that should be honored.
It's because you're awesome.
Back at you. So we will catch you all on the flip side. Thanks.
Indeed, and I will keep updates up on my Twitter as soon as we get dates on, or you can check Trooper's Twitter.
And there will be information. I'm gonna say it's gonna be so good, so good. That's all. That's it.
So can I have one request?
Yes.
Can there be a trumpet somewhere?
Oh yeah. Are you sure trumpet and not saxophone?
No, like for me, and this is a personal aesthetic. When we're talking about Harlem Renaissance era, and even though this is a little bit after, we're talking about later in the area. Trumpet comes to mind, and when I think of noir, I think trumpet.
Oh, with a nice Harmon mute.
Yeah. Because I think of to this day saxophone is smooth, and there's something about noir that is not supposed to be comfortable. And then we talk about Cthulhu on top of that. You're not supposed to be comfortable. You're supposed to. There's harmony in there. There's melodies. It's beautiful, but you should never feel at ease. And that's what the trumpet is to me. Yeah,
I love that nice muted trumpet. It's got that really kind of like, or a nice wah. Yes. I say yes. Thank you, everybody. And Lizzie, thank you for hanging out with us. I see you over there, Lizzie. And Lizzie, you know, Atlanta Nights. That's all. Just Atlanta Nights. Take care, everyone, and we will catch you on the flip side.